In 1998, two investment bankers named Joseph Park and Yong Kang launched Kozmo.com from an apartment in New York City. The premise was simple enough to fit on a napkin. Order anything you want, movies, snacks, books, toiletries, and have it delivered to your door in under an hour. No delivery fee, no minimum order. Kozmo raised approximately $250 million from investors, including Amazon, Chase, and major venture firms. By 2000, it operated in 11 major American cities, employed over 3,000 people, and had filed for an IPO. The company reported losses of $26 million on only $3.5 million in revenue in 1999. In April 2001, Kozmo locked its doors without warning one morning, and its employees were notified when they arrived to find themselves locked out. In 2013, a company called Instacart launched. Same core proposition: order groceries and have them delivered within hours. By 2022, Instacart was valued at approximately $39 billion. Amazon Prime Now launched in 2014. 1-hour delivery in major cities. It operates profitably at scale today. The question that the standard retelling of the Kozmo story doesn't fully answer is this: if the idea was sound enough to produce multi-billion-dollar companies a decade later, why did it fail so completely when it was tried first? The answer is not simple, and anyone who reduces it to a single cause, the infrastructure wasn't ready or the business model was broken, is leaving out the part that makes the story instructive. Both things were true. The infrastructure wasn't fully ready, and the business model, as designed, was also broken. Understanding how these two failures interacted is the specific thing that changes how you evaluate any business that is built on a proposition the market hasn't fully validated yet. Kozmo's business model had a structural problem that existed independently of the infrastructure conditions of 2000. The model proved unsustainable due to razor-thin profit margins, high operational costs from free deliveries, and over-reliance on unproven demand without achieving profitability. A company delivering a $12 order at no charge, using a full-time employee on a bicycle in a city like Manhattan, cannot generate the margin required to sustain operations, regardless of what year it is, and regardless of whether the smartphone exists. Oxiv. This is the first thing the timing narrative elides. Some of Kozmo's problems were not timing problems. They were fundamental unit economics problems that would have required a different model, not different conditions. Kozmo provided free delivery of purchased goods with no minimum purchase cost. This tactic left little room for profit and sustainability. The company's founders understood this was a problem and responded with growth. The theory being that at sufficient scale, order density per delivery zone would bring the per delivery cost down to a sustainable level. The theory was plausible. It required reaching a scale that the company's capital and timeline couldn't sustain. So we have two problems operating simultaneously. The first, a unit economic structure that required massive scale to work and capital that ran out before that scale was reached. The second, infrastructure conditions that, in 2000, were genuinely less favorable than they would become by 2013. The smartphone reduced the friction of placing an order on the move, driving more orders per customer per week, which drives the density math. The GPS routing that improved dramatically between 2000 and 2013 reduced the time and distance cost of each delivery, which directly improves unit economics. The gig economy labor model made the cost of delivery variable rather than fixed. Instacart shoppers are paid per order, not salaried. That single change transforms the math of the entire model. Have you ever been inside a business that had two different problems? One that time would solve and one that required a fundamental model change, and watch those two problems get treated as if they were the same problem? Leave a comment. The distinction between a timing failure and a model failure matters enormously. because the lesson you take from each is different, and the wrong lesson produces the wrong response. If Kozmo failed purely because of timing, because the infrastructure conditions weren't present, then the appropriate lesson is patience. Wait for the conditions to arrive, then execute the same model. This is essentially what Instacart did. But Instacart also made specific design choices that Kozmo didn't: a minimum order requirement, a delivery fee, a gig economy labor structure. These are not timing differences. These are model differences. Webvan made similar errors on a larger scale. The infrastructure-heavy software development process required proven demand before massive capital deployment. Webvan built enormous, custom-designed fulfillment centers at enormous capital cost before the demand required to fill them was established. The company was not wrong about the direction of grocery delivery. It was wrong about the capital structure required to test whether the direction was right, and wrong about the unit economics of the specific model it had chosen to execute. The companies that came after, Instacart, Amazon Fresh, DoorDash, didn't simply wait for the conditions to improve. They also rebuilt the model around the improved conditions in ways that required accepting lower margins, different labor structures, and a different relationship between the platform and the inventory. If this level of precision, distinguishing what was a timing problem from what was a model problem within the same failure, is what makes this channel worth your time. The like is the direct signal. The employees who lost their jobs when Kozmo locked its doors in April 2001, the delivery workers, the warehouse staff, the technology team, were working for a company that had two distinct sets of problems, only one of which would have been resolved by waiting. Kozmo shut its doors in April 2001, and employees were notified when the doors were locked that morning. There was no severance announcement in advance. The people who showed up to work one morning and found themselves locked out were not privy to the capital situation, the investor negotiations, or the fundamental model problems that had been accumulating since launch. The $250 million that had been invested from Amazon, from Chase, from major venture firms, was not spent recklessly in any simple sense. It was spent executing a model that the investors believed would reach the scale required to make the economics work before the capital ran out. The investors were wrong, but the wrongness was distributed. Wrong about the model's unit economics at any scale, wrong about how much scale would be required, wrong about the timeline the capital could sustain. The people who bore the cost of that wrongness most directly were the ones who had the least access to the analysis that produced it. The practical lesson from the timing failure is not wait for better conditions. It is more specific. Before launching any business model that requires multiple enabling conditions to be present simultaneously, identify which of those conditions are currently present and which are not, and distinguish between the ones that will arrive with time and the ones that require active design choices to address. Kozmo needed four things: sufficient order density, low enough delivery cost, a labor structure that made delivery variable rather than fixed, and a pricing model that generated margin. In 2000, two of these were partially unavailable. Order density was limited by smartphone absence. Delivery cost was higher without GPS optimization. Two of them were design choices that Kozmo made incorrectly regardless of the year: free delivery with no minimum and a fully salaried last-mile labor force. Instacart addressed all four in conditions where the first two had improved. That's not just better timing. That's a better model, built for better conditions by people who had studied why the prior attempt failed. The practical thing: for any business model that has previously failed in your category, run the four-part analysis. What conditions were absent at the time of failure? Which of those conditions are now present? And what model decisions did the prior failure make, independent of the conditions, that contributed to the failure and that your model needs to specifically address? We're different because the timing is right. Analyses stop at the first two questions. The third one is where the instructive part lives. The next episode looks at a case where the timing was right and the model was sound, and the category leader still handed the market to a competitor through a specific product and organizational decision rather than a macroeconomic condition. This content was developed with the support of artificial intelligence tools and underwent human review, editorial curation, and approval before publication. The analysis presented here is strictly educational and philosophical in nature, grounded in behavioral psychology and classical stoicism.